I feel like the world is on the verge of collapse. That's what I feel like. I'm quite serious. I mean, not scientifically. That has exploded. But as we sit here, I find it very difficult to think that whether I'm a conductor or a composer of any note at all has any bearing on anything, or that my existence is even worth talking about for this book.
Girl, you be pregnant again? Mights be, I tells her. And if I is, Ray Ray is gonna be a real father this time around. Thank you.
The internet is full of people surprisingly skilled at predicting the outcome of the Academy Awards. People who can analyze and gamble on the relationship between commercial success, industry trends, Academy gatekeeping, and critical opinion. I myself am completely out of touch with popular film culture, if there even is such a thing. It seems to me that each day one can find another review, another essay declaring, just like they did the year before, either that cinema is going through some kind of rebirth, or that it's in a general state of decline. And honestly, both sound pretty convincing. What strikes me, and perhaps it's just a coincidence, is that the time at which the Academy expanded the selection of nominees for Best Film and exploded the number of Academy members.
That hashtag Oscar so white is so important.
That is, the moment after which the logic of the proceedings became inscrutable to me, is the same time that saw the widespread adoption of digital cameras and projectors in commercial production and exhibition, as well as the transition from rental houses to streaming services. The same time the market changed and the medium changed, where cinema became yet another victim absorbed into the nebulous and monolithic internet, digital, smartphone pleasure matrix. So, at a loss, and in absence of any kind of broad cultural analysis, I'll merely point out a couple overarching themes to this year's selection before I get into the list, and let the viewer draw their own conclusions. The word of the day is pretentious. There's something very put on, for example, about the way Maestro moves through visual styles, changing aspect ratio and color grade as its narrative moves through time, or the way Oppenheimer does almost the inverse, and changes not only from black and white to color and back, but also from 35mm to IMAX ratios, sometimes multiple times within the same scene. Watching this year's films, I wonder if we haven't reached a point in time where the technical mastery of film, and I don't just mean production values, but also more abstract things like shot choice, editing, and narrative structure, that is, the formal grammar of the medium, has become so accessible and second nature that even the most by-the-numbers, cynical projects can still look really good. This seems an important point, especially when one considers that this year's selection is not only generally more reserved than last year's, but also generally much better. I can imagine the members of the Academy looking at the Golden Globes recently christened, quote, Cinematic and Box Office Achievement category, and wincing with embarrassment.
It's so what nobody knew they needed.
Maybe what we see this year is a reaction against that kind of concession to popular taste. That the stuffiness which leads one to nominate serious foreign dramas, and whatever the hell Poor Things is the same attitude which leads one to be fooled into thinking that slow editing and heavy film grain are signs of maturity.
You know what I want?
What?
Chicken wings.
Holy shit.
I have as little to say about this movie as its characters do about each other. Its plot is paper thin, and the only real drama, the protagonist's two relationships, one real, one imagined, squaring off in person, doesn't arrive until much too late. When one reads that the film is semi-autobiographical, and then watches as all the side characters constantly puff Nora up, and as she explains to them in the most pat way possible all the lessons they should be learning from this experience, one grows a little suspicious. The languid pace can sometimes lend itself to contemplative moods, though that starts to wear itself thin pretty quickly. There might be some idea in here about amplifying the ordinariness of each moment of our lives, but it just serves to highlight the utter mediocrity of it all.
I was just thinking about what a good story this is.
Well, let's make the best of it, shall we?
Speaking of mediocrity, we come to a movie whose formal elements feel like they were picked in the same way as that South Park joke about the manatees and the idea balls. Or maybe they asked a computer algorithm, and it told them this year's hot tropes are New England boarding schools in the 1970s. And why not? The vintage presentation looks like old film stock, though the digitalness comes through in the sharpness of it all. That is, it looks far cleaner and more precise than any actual movie from the 70s. And the dialogue will continually remind the viewer just how modern it is. See the gotcha moment line of dialogue uttered by Giamatti in the finale. The characters feel like broad types that we've seen before, but there's a forced quality to all the dialogue and performances that make them oddly incongruent. Its plotting announces itself early, and we can easily predict where it's going most of the time. We know Paul's demeanor is a cover for something that makes him sympathetic. We know there's more to the story with Angus's family. We know everyone will be brought closer in the end. I suppose this is true of all Christmas movies, though they don't usually get Best Film nominations. But it's all familiar, only the parts have been rearranged.
Stop it, Ken.
I'm sorry.
Barbie is a big, funny, colorful, and charming summer splash, and I have to assume one of the keys to its huge success is that it at least bears the appearance of engaging critically with society and politics. Though whatever its message is supposed to be in the end is quite confused, to say the least. It's one of the more insidious breeds of postmodern wank that feels free to take insipid shots at capitalism, while simultaneously furthering its ends in the most cynical way possible. The art direction is truly a feast for the eyes, and the performances are all good, but like a pop hit written by one of its many musical contributors, disgraced or otherwise, if you put on Barbie once, you pretty much get the point.
We would love it if you could just get into that giant box. Get into the box?
Mr. Bernstein is 37 years old, but he has been in the public eye for a dozen years. From the time he substituted for Bruno Walter to conduct the Philharmonic Symphony at the age of 25. Since then, Leonard Bernstein has conducted or played all over the world.
Perhaps an unsurprising thing to say about a movie made by an actor. Its greatest strength is its psychological realism. Bradley Cooper's performance as Leonard Bernstein is hugely expressive, brimming with eccentricity and mannerism, and goes a long way in making the character believable. This maestro is positively manic, and his energy and excitement and affection are shown to be symptoms of something darker, something fearful. Even his sexuality, in a bold move, starts to look like an extension of this impulsivity. Many scenes play out in an improvisational way, the actors riffing, their dialogue overlapping, giggling or crying. Many of these play out in some static shot, framed in an ostentatiously unorthodox way, like Cooper had been watching Ozu or European art cinema, or more likely some Woody Allen film that ripped these off, and thought that this kind of experimentation would inherently make the film more interesting. And maybe it does. It must be said, and it's honestly remarkable, that barely a word is uttered about Bernstein's music at all. Sometimes it's used as background, often as a kind of nostalgic gimmick, for example, trying to emulate the style of classical Hollywood. There are a few scattered remarks about the relationship between composing and performing, and maybe it's simply taking for granted the audience's familiarity with his work. But by the time it's over, I doubt many will feel much closer to understanding why the artist or his art is important.
About the 4 years where you couldn't decide if you wanted to marry me.
That's what I think.
The idea of you.
It's like that Richard Chamberlain movie that we saw last week, and he said, "How could I ever compete with the man that you think I am?"
Mr. Lee, is this based on your actual life?
Yeah, you think some bitch-ass college boy can come up with that shit?
No, I don't. No.
The plot centers around a book. It's a cynical work, almost satire, secretly made to mock the kinds of work black people in America are expected to write. One character, a writer asked to judge it for an award, searching her mind for a moment and trying to describe it, lands on the word soulless.
Soulless?
Incidentally, in my own humble judgment of this award ceremony, I should feel inclined to use the same word to describe a few of the films on this list. It's a relief, then, to say that the flaws of American fiction are just regular, earnest ones. Its themes start to feel a little repetitive, and some creative decisions a little hackneyed, but the writing never feels cynical or pandering. Generally, the dialogue is strong and the performance is believable. There are many genuinely funny moments, and the interactions between Monk and his family are touching and sympathetic. The relative restraint of the visual design alone is refreshing. It shares some reflections on an industry and cultural sphere that doesn't often get much attention, and ultimately it gives the impression of having something to say, something similar to, for example, Spike Lee's Bamboozled, which came out around the same time as its source material. Something that, amazingly, has only become more relevant since. While the medium of courtroom drama might feel pretty tired for many viewers, this one included, Anatomy of a Fall somehow still manages to wring a great deal of emotion out of its story concerning a woman being investigated for her husband's death. Her guilt is almost beside the point. Instead, the trial is used as a way to methodically dissect their marriage right in front of their adolescent child. Despite the well-worn territory, there's some novelty in the way it stages the courtroom scenes, and the really incredible acting goes a long way. The prosecution involves repeatedly forcing Sandra to render something that is deeply complex and messy into the straightforward language of legal testimony. And while she tries to maintain that nuance, being contradicted at every turn, she has to deal with the added layer of frustration that comes with the language barrier. As we find out, and unbeknownst to their child, Daniel, the relationship is pretty rocky. And the story is at its most moving when focusing on this unfortunate initiation of Daniel's, his reckoning with the fact that his parents are, like any other human beings, deeply flawed. The picture that emerges of their relationship, and of the husband Samuel's struggle with his art and with his son's accident, is genuinely deeply moving.
Why? Why? How about because this is the most important fucking thing to ever happen in the history of the world? How about that? Fuck.
Let's set aside the usual pitfalls of a Christopher Nolan movie, the utterly shit dialogue which can only be heard through the mix half the time.
You have everyone convinced you're more complicated than you actually are.
The shallow female characters, the ridiculous ways of convoluting the plot, the dumb comic book trappings. Oppenheimer even has an epic superhero suit-up moment, and just focus on one scene. In it, our titular protagonist is being drilled with questions about his so-called moral scruples around building the atomic bomb. He stumbles over his words, contradicting himself in what sound like rehearsed lines. Visual effects in the background combined with bassy grumbles on the soundtrack give the scene an intense destabilizing feel. And it intercuts with another scene, shot in black and white, which concerns the apparent antagonist of the film basically grappling with the fact that he isn't an important enough figure for this story. In a way, this scene encapsulates the whole film. The traditional biopic formula is, thank God, dispensed with. The old and naughty moral debate around the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki sidestepped. If Oppenheimer has a justification for his role, and maybe he doesn't, it's one that would only ever make sense in his heady, idiosyncratic view of things. Instead, the focus is on the scale of it all. And throughout the movie, Nolan has found remarkably creative ways to express these characters' struggle to understand their place in history, the universe, and in the new world they've created. That is, our world. In this context, the immediate considerations and dangers of building the atomic bomb take on much wider symbolic meaning. What I'm getting at is, for those of us who've grown cynical and dismissive of Nolan's style over the years, there's a great deal to be surprised and impressed with. Those who've seen the likes of Dogtooth might be forgiven for not taking at face value the sentimentality at the heart of Yorgos Lanthimos' most recent film. It's not to say it doesn't have the same trademark bleakness and dark humor, but by the time it wraps up its quasi-feminist themes of maturity and bodily autonomy, one almost gives it the side-eye, asking, is he taking the piss? Little can be taken seriously in this whimsical farce, which contains fabulous, stylistic elements fitting of Tim Burton and Wes Anderson. Its depiction of 19th century Europe fluctuates between fantastic and grotesque. Its cinematography relies heavily on showy tracking shots and high and wide angles, often going as far as using irises, like when we're looking through a peephole. Its art direction is absurd, from the wardrobe to the furnishings of its interiors to the gaudy CGI tableaus, and it all hangs on a script that is equal parts audacious and offensive. It's a dense movie, in other words, one that is difficult to make heads or tails of, and that needs time to digest, even though it often feels less like digestion and more like godless biological experimentation. what is now an established and sometimes troubled genre in its own right, Jonathan Glazer adds his contribution to the Holocaust film, asking right from the beginning some fundamental questions about representation itself. Hardly any Jew is seen in the film, and though the insane acts of systematic murder are never really shown, they are implied, and especially heard, at nearly every moment. In a static wide shot, a locomotive is obscured, but we can still see the smoke. In a tighter shot, we can't see a line of prisoners being corralled along a path, but we can see, above the grass, the wardens on horseback shouting at them. The film turns what Hannah Arendt famously called the banality of evil on its head, when the family of Rudolf Höss, commander of Auschwitz, goes about its daily business, entertaining guests and tending to their garden. It's impossible for us to accept that they could simply ignore the gunshots and screams just on the other side of the wall. Try as they might, no matter how psychotic one must be to live here, and no matter how faithfully they've accepted the Nazi ideology, this horror must have some effect on their minds and bodies. Basically plotless, it ends before any kind of resolution or reassurances to the audience can be made, and it vaguely suggests some ideas that are sure to provoke debate. It's a risky film, and its place in the canon will be weighed on those qualities which are at the same time its best and its most questionable.
Thinking who I gotta beat in this horse race, that's all.
I didn't realize this was a race. I don't care for watching horses.
Well, I'm a different kind of horse.
The worst you can say about Scorsese is that he continues to work in a style that he established a very long time ago. A superficial look at his latest film will indeed reveal off-kilter flourishes, eruptions of violence, and frenetic editing that can be found in some of his earliest works. But what such a cynical take will miss is the depths to which he has explored this style, the increasing complexity and subtlety with which he treats the figures at the center of his stories. At the center of this story, based on true events, is the relationship between Ernest Burkhart, a returning American World War I vet, and Molly Kyle, a member of the Osage Nation who, at that time in history, had recently come into a great deal of wealth thanks to the deposits of oil found in their land. Right off the bat, the white characters are shown to be predatory opportunists. Ernest's uncle, William Hale, played by a chilling Robert De Niro, suggests to him he ought to marry an Osage woman, which Ernest promptly does, to gain legal access to that wealth, access that even the Osage aren't trusted with. But the meat of the story comes in investigating whether Ernest does actually love Molly, and what that love looks like. Is it possible for a man to commit vicious and greedy acts of evil on someone and still love them? And what kind of man would that be? What kind of society would enable such a thing? It's an epic story, playing out across nearly 3.5 hours, and while it moves briskly, it also doesn't shrink from the utterly depressing reality of this chapter of colonial and capitalist history. As Molly, the emotional heart of it, becomes increasingly unwell, members of her family dropping like flies, so too does the film become shakier, culminating in a shocking trip-out bender of fire and psychedelic music. Finally, the whole thing wraps up in a gutsy meta-sequence involving Scorsese himself. It would take a Herculean act of self-delusion to watch these moments and see anything resembling staleness.